Some bonds run deeper than blood, and some friendships transcend the natural order of things. In the harsh Wyoming Territory of 1872, frontier rancher Elias Boone discovered this truth when he found a dying wolf pup and nursed it back to life. For years, the wolf became his most trusted companion, more loyal than any man and fiercer than any guard dog. But when the wolf returns home, bloodied and broken from a fight in the wilderness, the townsfolk demand it be put down before it turns on their livestock. With tears in his eyes, Elias prepares to grant his old friend the mercy of a peaceful death. That's when he notices something that changes everything, a strange piece of iron embedded deep in the wolf's wounds, bearing the mark of a notorious outlaw gang that vanished years ago. The wolf had found something in those mountains, something worth killing for. But what secret could be buried so deep in the wilderness that men would die to protect it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory stretched endless and unforgiving under the pale morning sun, its vast grasslands broken only by the occasional stand of cottonwoods or the distant purple shadows of mountains. Here, in this land where winter could kill a man as easily as a bullet, Elias Boone had carved out something resembling peace. His ranch house sat modest but sturdy against the rolling hills, built from logs he'd cut himself and chinked with mud that bore the honest sweat of his labor. Smoke rose steady from the stone chimney, carrying with it the scent of coffee and bacon that spoke of routine, of a life deliberately simple. After years of complexity, he preferred not to remember. Elias stood on his porch, watching the sun climb higher, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup that had seen better decades. At 52, his hair had gone mostly gray, and lines mapped his face like the dry creek beds that scarred the prairie. But his shoulders remained broad, his stance steady, and his pale blue eyes still held the alertness of a man who'd learned that survival often depended on noticing what others missed. Leaning against the doorframe behind him was his Winchester rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth by countless hands, and its metal parts kept clean despite their age. That rifle had been his companion through battles he'd rather forget, but now it served a different purpose: protecting cattle from coyotes, putting down sick animals, and occasionally reminding visiting troublemakers that this particular rancher had earned his solitude through means they'd be wise not to test. 6 years had passed since he'd hung up his cavalry uniform and claimed this patch of earth through the Homestead Act. 6 years since he'd decided that a man could choose what battles to fight. And sometimes the wisest choice was to fight none at all. The war had taken enough from him: friends, innocence, and a young wife who'd grown tired of waiting for a husband who kept finding reasons to stay in uniform rather than come home to face what peace might demand of him. But solitude, he'd learned, didn't mean loneliness, not when you had the right companion. "Morning, Shadow," he said softly, glancing toward the barn where his closest friend usually waited for the day's routine to begin. The wolf didn't emerge. Shadow had been no larger than Elias's fist when he'd found him, a scrap of fur and determination clinging to life beside his dead mother in a cave up in the Medicine Bow Mountains. Common sense had suggested leaving the pup to nature's way, but something in those yellow eyes had spoken to him, a stubbornness that matched his own. Perhaps, or simply the recognition of another creature that had lost everything and refused to quit. He'd carried the pup home wrapped in his coat, fed him with a cloth soaked in warm milk, and spent long nights by the fire nursing the small life that seemed determined to survive despite every reason to surrender. The townspeople of Cedar Falls had called him foolish, dangerous even, when word spread that Elias Boone was raising a wolf like a dog. "That thing'll turn on you," warned Samuel Morrison, the town's banker, and one of the few men who'd occasionally ride out to check on Elias's welfare. "It's their nature. Wild is wild." But Shadow had proven them wrong year after year. He'd grown into a magnificent creature, larger than most dogs, with a coat the color of storm clouds and intelligence that sometimes seemed almost human. He'd never shown aggression toward Elias or the few visitors brave enough to call, though his presence alone was usually sufficient to discourage trouble. Together, they'd worked this land through seasons of plenty and hardship. Shadow could track a straying steer through terrain that would challenge an Indian scout, and his presence kept predators at a respectful distance from the cattle. More than that, he'd become the family Elias had never quite managed to build with another human being. Now, as the morning stretched toward midday and Shadow still hadn't appeared, Elias felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling that had kept him alive through Shiloh and Gettysburg, the instinct that whispered when something wasn't right. He set down his coffee and walked toward the barn, his boots crunching softly on the frost that still lingered in the shadows, despite the season's warming trend. The building smelled of hay and leather, familiar and comforting, but the corner where Shadow usually slept lay empty except for the old blanket Elias had given him years ago. "Shadow," he called, stepping back outside and scanning the horizon. The land stretched away in all directions, offering 1,000 places for a wolf to wander, but Shadow had never missed a morning routine in all their years together. He was a creature of habit, dependable as sunrise, always returning from his evening hunts to sleep in the barn and greet the dawn with Elias. 3 days passed without a sign of him. On the 4th morning, as Elias stood on his porch with coffee growing cold in his hands, he spotted a familiar grey shape moving slowly across the pasture. But something was wrong with the way Shadow moved, a labored gait, a hesitation in his step that spoke of pain or exhaustion. As the wolf drew closer, Elias could see the extent of his injuries. Shadow's coat was matted with dried blood, his left ear torn, and fresh wounds marked his shoulders and flanks. He moved like a creature that had fought for his life and barely won, each step deliberate and careful. "Jesus," Elias breathed, setting down his cup and hurrying toward his injured friend. But before he could reach Shadow, the sound of approaching horses drew his attention. A group of riders crested the hill behind his house, 5 men from Cedar Falls, led by Sheriff Tom Bradley, a decent man whose job required him to balance the peace with the fears of townspeople who'd never quite understood why a man would choose a wolf for company. "Morning, Elias," Bradley called out as the group approached. He was a tall man with a graying mustache and the careful demeanor of someone who'd learned that most problems could be solved with conversation rather than gunfire. "Heard your wolf came back." The other riders were merchants and ranchers Elias recognized but didn't count as friends, men who'd tolerated his unusual choice of companion as long as Shadow stayed on his land and caused no trouble. Now, they sat their horses with the rigid posture of men who'd made up their minds about what needed doing. "He's hurt," Elias said simply, continuing toward Shadow, who had stopped moving and stood swaying slightly on his feet. "Hurt and dangerous," said Marcus Webb, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county. "Look at those wounds, Boone. That animal's been in a fight. Probably with wolves or maybe a bear. Animals that fight like that, they change. The killing instinct gets stronger." "He's never harmed anyone," Elias replied, kneeling beside Shadow and gently examining the wounds. The wolf's breathing was labored, and his yellow eyes held a weariness that spoke of suffering beyond the physical injuries. "Maybe not before," Bradley said, his voice carrying the reluctant authority of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "But Marcus has a point. We've got families in town, children. If that wolf turns aggressive, he won't." "You can't know that," Webb interrupted. "Wild animals that get hurt, they get unpredictable. Could attack livestock, could attack people. We can't take that risk." Elias looked up at the assembled men, reading the determination in their faces. These weren't cruel men, just frightened ones, and fear had a way of making even reasonable people do unreasonable things. He understood their concern, could even respect it, but understanding didn't make their demand any easier to accept. "What are you asking me to do?" Bradley's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry, Elias. I truly am. But that animal needs to be put down, for everyone's safety, including his own. Look at him, he's suffering. It'd be a mercy." Elias's hand moved to Shadow's head, feeling the familiar warmth of fur beneath his fingers. The wolf looked up at him with those intelligent yellow eyes, and for a moment, Elias could swear he saw understanding their acceptance of what had to come. 6 years of companionship, 6 years of shared mornings and long evenings by the fire, 6 years of having someone to talk to, even if that someone never answered with words. The best friendship he'd ever known, and now these men were asking him to end it with his own hands. But looking at Shadow's condition, seeing the pain in those yellow eyes and the way his breathing came short and labored, Elias had to admit they might be right. Not about the danger he'd stake his life on, Shadow's gentle nature, but about the mercy. "I'll do it," he said quietly, "but I'll do it my way, in my own time." Bradley nodded, relief evident in his posture. "That's fair. Just don't wait too long, Elias. The townspeople are worried." The riders departed, leaving Elias alone with Shadow in the morning stillness. He helped the wounded wolf to the barn, settling him on the old blanket and bringing water and what food Shadow might be able to manage. The wolf drank gratefully but showed no interest in eating. As the day wore on, Elias found himself remembering all the moments that had built their friendship, the first successful hunt they'd shared. The winter, when Shadow's presence had been the only thing between Elias and the kind of loneliness that could drive a man to madness. The countless evenings when the wolf had simply lain beside his chair while he read by lamplight. By evening, he'd made his peace with what had to be done. Shadow was suffering, and no amount of sentiment would change that truth. The kindest thing, the right thing, was to grant him a peaceful end. He loaded his rifle with hands that remained steady despite the heaviness in his heart. Shadow watched him with those knowing eyes, and when Elias knelt beside him, the wolf struggled to lift his head and press his muzzle against Elias's chest in one final gesture of affection. It was then, as Shadow's weight settled against him in what felt like a farewell embrace, that Elias noticed something unusual. Embedded deep in the wolf's shoulder, barely visible through the matted fur, was a small piece of metal. Not a bullet, something else entirely. Working carefully, he extracted the shard with his knife. It was roughly triangular, made of iron, and bore the unmistakable mark that had been burned into his memory during his cavalry days. A crimson rider on horseback, the symbol of one of the most ruthless outlaw gangs to terrorize the frontier during and after the war. The Crimson Riders had been responsible for countless robberies, murders, and acts of brutality that had made them the most wanted criminals in the territory. But they'd vanished years ago, supposedly wiped out in a final battle with federal marshals up in the Medicine Bow Mountains. Yet here was their mark, embedded in Shadow's flesh like a message from the dead. As Elias held the shard up to the lamplight, studying the familiar symbol, a new understanding began to form. Shadow hadn't been in a random fight with wild animals. He'd found something up in those mountains. Something connected to the Crimson Riders, and someone had tried to kill him for it. The rifle suddenly felt heavier in his hands, but for different reasons entirely. The iron shard caught the lamplight like a small piece of captured flame, its edges sharp enough to draw blood if handled carelessly. Elias turned it over in his palm, studying the symbol that had haunted his nightmares for the better part of a decade. The Crimson Riders. Even their name brought back the taste of dust and gunpowder, the screams of dying horses, and the particular stillness that followed violent death. He'd fought them twice during his cavalry days, once at Devil's Canyon, where they'd ambushed a supply train and left 17 soldiers dead, and again near Fort Collins, where his unit had arrived too late to save a family of homesteaders, but in time to see the smoke rising from their burning cabin. They'd been ghosts then, striking without warning and vanishing into the wilderness like smoke in wind. Their leader, a man known only as Scarred Jack, had earned his reputation through acts of brutality that made hardened soldiers cross themselves and pray for different orders. But the Crimson Riders were supposed to be finished. Marshal Henderson had assured everyone in the territory that the gang had been eliminated in a final battle up in the Medicine Bow Mountains 3 years past. Their bodies had been found scattered across a box canyon, their horses shot, their stolen gold recovered and returned to the banks they'd robbed. Yet here was their symbol, fresh and sharp, embedded in Shadow's flesh, like evidence of their resurrection. Elias set the shard on his workbench and returned to Shadow, who watched him with those intelligent yellow eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. The wolf's breathing had grown more labored as the evening progressed, and his wounds showed no signs of healing, despite Elias's attempts to clean them. "What did you find up there, old friend?" he asked softly, running his hand along Shadow's flank. "What did you stumble across that someone wanted to kill you for?" Shadow lifted his head with obvious effort and let out a low whine, not of pain, but of something that sounded almost like urgency. His eyes moved toward the door, then back to Elias, as if trying to communicate something vital. The collar around Shadow's neck had been a gift Elias had fashioned years ago from soft leather, tooled with simple designs that reminded him of his grandmother's needlework. Now it was torn and blood-stained, marked with teeth marks that spoke of a vicious fight. But as Elias examined it more closely, he noticed something else: pine needles and soil caught in the leather, but not the kind of soil found on his ranch. This earth was darker, richer, with the distinctive smell of high-altitude forests. Shadow had been far from home when he'd encountered whatever had left these wounds. A soft knock at the barn door interrupted his thoughts. Elias looked up to see Sarah Miller standing in the doorway, a basket in her hands, and concern written across her weathered features. Sarah ran the boarding house in Cedar Falls and had been one of the few townspeople who'd never shown fear around Shadow. "Brought some soup," she said simply, setting the basket down and approaching slowly. "Thought you might be hungry, considering." She gestured toward Shadow without finishing the sentence. "That's kind of you, Sarah." She knelt beside the wolf, her movements careful but unafraid. Shadow had always been gentle with her, perhaps sensing a kindred spirit in someone else who'd lost more than her share to this harsh country. Her husband had died in a mining accident 5 years back, leaving her to raise 2 children alone and run a business that barely kept them fed. "He's in a bad way," she observed, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd seen enough death to recognize its approach. "Yes, he is. The men in town are saying he got into a fight with wolves, maybe a bear, that he's turned dangerous." Her eyes met Elias's. "But you don't believe that?" It wasn't a question. Sarah had known him long enough to read the thoughts he kept hidden from others. "No," he said. "I don't." She nodded, studying Shadow's wounds with the careful attention of someone who'd nursed her share of injuries. "These look like knife cuts to me. Some of them, anyway. And that tear in his ear that's not from teeth or claws." Elias felt a flicker of validation. Sarah had tended wounds of all kinds during her years running the boarding house, patching up cowboys, miners, and travelers who'd found trouble on the frontier. If she saw evidence of human violence, it wasn't his imagination. "There's something else," he said, reaching for the iron shard. "Found this embedded in his shoulder." Sarah took the piece of metal, holding it close to the lamp. Her expression changed as she recognized the symbol, her face paling slightly. "Where did he get this? That's what I intend to find out." She handed the shard back to him, her movements careful. "Elias, the Crimson Riders are dead. Everyone knows that. Marshal Henderson showed the territory their bodies himself. Bodies can be mistaken for other bodies. Names can be taken by new men." He tucked the shard into his vest pocket, "But this symbol doesn't lie. Even if you're right, even if some of them survived or others took up their name, what does that mean? What can you do about it?" It was a reasonable question, one he'd been asking himself since the discovery. What could one man do against a gang of outlaws, especially a man who'd chosen peace over conflict, solitude over involvement in other people's troubles? But as he looked at Shadow, seeing the pain in those yellow eyes and the way the wolf's breathing grew more shallow with each passing hour, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the cold, focused anger that had made him an effective cavalry officer. Someone had hurt his friend. Someone had tried to kill the only family he had left, and if that someone was connected to the Crimson Riders, then they'd chosen the wrong man to cross. "I'm going to find out what Shadow discovered," he said, "and I'm going to make sure whoever did this answers for it." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the lamplight. "The town expects you to put him down, Elias. They won't wait much longer." "I know. And if you start chasing ghosts instead of doing what they asked, they'll come back with guns instead of requests." He finished the thought for her. "I understand. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "Be careful. Whatever Shadow found up there, it was worth killing for. That means it's worth killing you for too." After she left, Elias sat alone with Shadow in the quiet barn, listening to the wind move through the eaves and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. The wolf's condition continued to deteriorate, his breathing growing more labored despite Elias's efforts to make him comfortable. By midnight, it was clear that Shadow was dying. But he wasn't dead yet, and as long as he drew breath, Elias wasn't ready to give up on him. The shard in his pocket felt heavier than its actual weight, carrying with it the promise of answers and the threat of violence. He'd spent 6 years building a peaceful life on this ranch, but peace was a luxury that apparently wasn't his to keep. He loaded a saddlebag with supplies, ammunition, food, medical kit, and the few tools that might prove useful in the mountains. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, sensed the change in routine and nickered softly as he prepared her tack by lamplight. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "We've got work to do." The plan was simple: follow Shadow's trail back into the mountains and find whatever the wolf had discovered. If he was lucky, he'd find evidence that would satisfy his curiosity and allow him to return home with answers. If he was unlucky, well, he'd been unlucky before and survived it. As dawn approached, Shadow stirred on his blanket, lifting his head with obvious effort. His yellow eyes found Elias's, and for a moment the wolf seemed almost alert, as if sensing that something important was about to happen. "You want to show me, don't you?" Elias said softly. "You want to show me what you found up there?" Shadow's tail moved in what might have been a weak attempt at wagging. The decision made itself. Instead of putting Shadow out of his misery, Elias would give him one last chance to be useful, to contribute to whatever justice might be found in the mountains. It was a risk the wolf might not survive the journey, might die in agony instead of peacefully in the barn, but something in Shadow's eyes suggested that he'd rather die trying than die lying still. Elias fashioned a travois from 2 long poles and a blanket, creating a makeshift stretcher that Copper could pull without too much difficulty. Getting Shadow onto it required patience and gentle handling, but the wolf seemed to understand what was happening and cooperated as much as his injuries allowed. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, they were ready. Elias mounted Copper, checked his weapons one final time, and looked back toward the ranch house that had been his refuge for 6 years. He had no way of knowing if he'd ever see it again. The trail Shadow had left was faint but readable to someone with Elias's experience. Drops of dried blood marked certain rocks, and the occasional tuft of grey fur caught on brush showed the path the injured wolf had taken home. It led northeast, toward the same Medicine Bow Mountains, where the Crimson Riders had supposedly met their end. As they climbed higher into the foothills, Elias found himself remembering other mountain trails, other pursuits that had ended in violence. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come to Wyoming to escape the wars of other men, only to find himself drawn back into conflict by the one creature he'd thought he could trust to live peacefully. But trust. He was learning, sometimes meant following someone into danger rather than keeping them safe at home. And if Shadow was willing to risk his remaining strength to show him something important, then Elias owed it to their friendship to see it through. The gang insignia shard felt like a piece of captured lightning in Elias's vest pocket as they climbed higher into the Medicine Bow Mountains, its sharp edges a constant reminder of the evil that had wounded his closest friend. The morning air carried the crisp bite of high altitude, where snow lingered in shadowed crevices despite the warming season, and every breath seemed to cut clean through a man's lungs. Shadow's trail led them along paths that spoke of ancient passage, deer runs worn smooth by countless hooves, elk tracks pressed deep into soft earth, and the subtle markers that only experienced hunters could read. Elias followed these signs with the patience of a man who'd learned during his cavalry years that haste in dangerous country often led to unmarked graves. The travois bumped and swayed behind Copper as they navigated around fallen logs and granite outcroppings, but Shadow bore the journey with stoic endurance. His yellow eyes remained alert despite his obvious pain, occasionally turning towards specific landmarks as if checking their progress against some internal map. "You remember this country, don't you?" Elias murmured during one of their rest stops, offering Shadow water from his cupped hands. "You know exactly where they hurt you." The wolf's response was to lift his head toward a distant ridge where morning shadows still clung to the rocks like dark fingers. His meaning was unmistakable. Whatever secrets lay hidden in these mountains, they were up there among the granite peaks where a man could hide from the law for years. As they climbed higher, Elias found himself remembering the Crimson Riders from his cavalry days. They'd been ghosts then, striking supply convoys and isolated settlements before vanishing into wilderness that seemed to swallow them whole. Their leader, the man called Scarred Jack, had earned his reputation through acts of brutality that made hardened soldiers cross themselves and pray for different assignments. The gang had supposedly been eliminated 3 years past, in a final battle with federal marshals, their bodies found scattered across a box canyon and their stolen gold recovered. Marshal Henderson had assured everyone in the territory that the threat was finished. The Crimson Riders, nothing more than an unpleasant memory. Yet here was their symbol, fresh and sharp, embedded in Shadow's flesh like a message from men who should have been long dead. "Tell me about them," Elias said to the mountain air, as if the peaks themselves might answer. "Tell me how dead men came back to hurt my friend." The trail grew steeper as they approached what appeared to be an abandoned mining camp, the kind of played-out operation that dotted these mountains like scars from the gold fever that had brought thousands of hopeful men west, only to send most of them home, poorer than they'd started. But this camp showed signs of recent use, cleared pathways, repaired structures, and the subtle evidence of ongoing human presence. "Someone's been living here," Elias observed, studying fresh horse tracks in the muddy ground around a small creek. "Recently, too." The tracks told a story of regular traffic, multiple horses coming and going, always carefully, always following routes that would minimize their visibility from the main trails. Whoever was using this camp understood the importance of remaining undetected. Among the abandoned mining equipment, Elias found something that made his blood run cold. Spent cartridge cases bearing the distinctive mark of government ammunition. Not the kind of bullets used by miners or prospectors, but military-issue rounds that suggested the camp's current occupants had access to weapons taken from federal armories. Shadow stirred on his travois, lifting his head to sniff the air with obvious recognition. His ears, torn though they were, pricked forward, in the way that meant he'd caught a familiar scent, not necessarily pleasant, but certainly significant. Following the wolf's gaze, Elias spotted movement among the trees above the camp. A figure watched them from the shadows, too distant to identify but close enough to suggest they were being evaluated by someone who understood the importance of remaining concealed. "We're expected," he said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward his Winchester. Question is whether we're walking into a trap or just making someone nervous." The watcher disappeared before Elias could get a better look, melting back into the forest with the practiced stealth of someone accustomed to avoiding detection. But the brief glimpse had been enough to confirm that the camp wasn't as abandoned as it appeared from a distance. They approached cautiously, Elias leading Copper on foot while scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of ambush or additional watchers. The mining camp consisted of several weathered buildings arranged around a central area that had probably served as the original operation's staging ground, but now looked like it might house entirely different activities. Fresh wood had been used to repair some of the structures, and new hardware gleamed on doors that should have been rusted shut years ago. Someone had invested considerable time and effort in making this isolated location suitable for long-term occupation. "Hello, the camp," Elias called out, using the traditional frontier greeting that announced peaceful intentions while requesting permission to approach. No answer came from the buildings, but Shadow's reaction suggested they weren't alone. The wolf's nose worked constantly, analyzing scents that carried information beyond human perception, and his expression held the focused intensity of a predator identifying potential threats. A rifle shot cracked across the canyon, the bullet striking a tree 20 feet to Elias's left and sending bark flying in all directions. The message was clear: no closer, turn around, leave immediately, or face more direct consequences. "That's far enough, stranger," a voice called from somewhere among the buildings. "State your business or move along. Looking for whoever hurt my wolf." Elias replied, his own rifle now ready, though not yet aimed at any specific target. "Found their calling card embedded in his shoulder, and I'd like to discuss the matter." A harsh laugh echoed across the camp. "Your wolf found something that didn't belong to him. Time to collect your animal and head back down the mountain. What did he find?" "Nothing that concerns you, old man. This is your only warning." The conversation confirmed what Elias had begun to suspect. Shadow hadn't simply encountered wild animals or random violence. He'd discovered something important enough that men were willing to kill to protect it. Something connected to the Crimson Rider's insignia that had nearly cost the wolf his life. "I understand your position," Elias called back, allowing his voice to carry a note of resignation. "But I'd appreciate the chance to retrieve something my wolf might have left behind when your people drove him off. Nothing here belongs to you or your wolf." "Maybe not, but a man's got a right to look after his friend's interests." The exchange was buying him time to study the camp's layout and identify the shooter's position. The voice came from the largest building, probably a converted bunkhouse that offered good fields of fire while providing solid cover. Professional positioning that suggested military training rather than the casual defensive measures used by ordinary criminals. Shadow made a soft sound that might have been agreement or warning, his yellow eyes fixed on the building where their unseen opponent had taken refuge. The wolf's attention seemed focused on something specific, as if he recognized not just the location, but the individual threatening them. "I'm going to move closer," Elias said quietly, knowing Shadow could hear him even if their hidden opponent couldn't. "See if I can get a better look at what we're dealing with." Using the mining equipment as cover, he worked his way closer to the buildings while keeping Copper and Shadow's travois positioned where they could retreat quickly if necessary. The approach required patience and careful movement, but his cavalry training had taught him how to advance under the threat of enemy fire. From his new position, he could see that the camp was more extensive than it had appeared from a distance. Several buildings showed evidence of recent use, and equipment was arranged with the kind of organization that suggested permanent rather than temporary occupation. More importantly, he caught a glimpse of the man who'd been threatening them, a young fellow, perhaps 25, with a kind of careful positioning and weapon handling that marked him as someone who'd been trained for this kind of work. Not a desperate outlaw hiding in the mountains, but a professional guard protecting something valuable. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," the young man called out. "But persistence can be dangerous in country like this." "So can shooting at peaceful travelers," Elias replied, especially when those travelers have friends in the territorial marshal's office. It was a bluff, but one that might make their opponent think twice about escalating the situation. The mention of official connections had the intended effect. The young man's position shifted slightly, suggesting he was reconsidering his options. "You're not just some rancher," came the response after a long pause. "The way you move, the way you handle that rifle, you're military." "Was military. Now I just want to know what my wolf found that's worth threatening strangers over." Another pause, longer this time, as if the young man was weighing his options against orders he'd received from someone else. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, less threatening, more uncertain. "There's things up here that are better left alone," he said finally. "Your wolf stumbled into business that could get both of you killed if you're not careful." "What kind of business?" "The kind that involves men who died years ago but somehow keep breathing." The cryptic answer sent a chill down Elias's spine. Combined with the Crimson Rider's insignia in his pocket, it suggested that the gang's supposed elimination had been nothing more than an elaborate deception, that the most notorious outlaws in territorial history had simply learned to hide better rather than face justice. "I think," Elias said slowly, "we need to have a longer conversation about this." The young man was quiet for several minutes, apparently struggling with a decision that could determine whether he lived or died. When he finally emerged from the building, his rifle was lowered but not set aside, and his face showed the strain of someone caught between conflicting loyalties. "My name's Billy," he said as he approached. "Billy Graves, and if I tell you what I know, we're both going to wish I'd kept my mouth shut." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the mountain valley, Elias made camp in a grove of aspens about half a mile from the Crimson Rider's headquarters. The location offered concealment while providing a clear view of the buildings below, allowing him to observe the patterns of movement and guard rotations that would be crucial for whatever action he decided to take. Billy had proven surprisingly cooperative once he understood that his choices had narrowed to helping Elias or facing the consequences of his gang membership alone. He'd provided detailed information about the camp's layout, the number of men typically present, and the routines they followed. More importantly, he'd confirmed what Elias had begun to suspect, that Webb's operation was far more sophisticated than a typical outlaw gang. "He keeps maps," Billy explained, as they watched smoke rise from the camp's chimneys. "Military maps mostly, left over from his cavalry days. Shows every trail, every water source, every place a man could hide or make a stand between here and the territorial border." "Webb was cavalry?" "Same as you, from what I gather. Served under Colonel Morrison during the Indian campaigns, which is how he and the banker got connected. They've been planning this for years, ever since they realized how much money flows through these territories without proper protection." The connection made sense. Military men understood logistics, planning, and the importance of intelligence gathering. They also understood how to blend into civilian populations and use legitimate positions to cover illegitimate activities. Webb hadn't stumbled into his role as a successful criminal. He'd engineered it with the same methodical approach he'd probably used to plan cavalry operations. From his saddlebags, Elias withdrew his own military map of the region, a detailed survey chart he'd kept from his cavalry days. The paper was yellowed with age and marked with annotations in his own careful handwriting notes about water sources, defensive positions, and the locations of various landmarks that had proven useful during his years of service. "Let me see Webb's maps," he said to Billy. "I don't have them. They're kept in the main building, in a locked chest. Webb doesn't trust anyone else with that kind of information." Elias spread his map on a flat rock, weighing the corners with stones to prevent the evening breeze from disturbing it. The terrain features were clearly marked, but what interested him most were the annotations he'd made during various operations, notes about hidden trails, defensive positions, and the kinds of geographical advantages that could turn a small force into an effective fighting unit. "Show me where the tax shipment convoy will be traveling," he instructed Billy. The young man studied the map, then traced a route with his finger. Here, along the main road through Eagle Pass. It's the only practical route for wagons carrying that much weight, and Webb's been scouting it for weeks. Elias examined the route, comparing it with his own knowledge of the terrain. Eagle Pass was a natural bottleneck, with steep cliffs on both sides and limited options for escape if an attack went wrong. It was also the kind of terrain that favored defenders over attackers, if someone with the right knowledge happened to be positioned correctly. How many men will Webb use for the robbery? All of them. 8 or 9 riders, plus him. It's supposed to be their final job, so nobody wants to take chances with a small crew. 10 men against a lightly guarded tax convoy would ensure success, but it would also leave the gang's mountain headquarters essentially undefended. That vulnerability might provide the opportunity Elias needed to strike at the heart of their operation, while the leadership was focused elsewhere. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. Shadow's condition had stabilized somewhat during their rest, though he remained weak and showed no interest in food. The wolf seemed content to lie on his blanket and watch the activities in the valley below, his yellow eyes tracking movement with the intensity of a predator studying potential prey. "He wants revenge," Billy observed, noticing Shadow's fixed attention on the camp. "He wants justice," Elias corrected. "There's a difference, is there, when you're planning to kill men in their sleep?" It was a fair question, one that Elias had wrestled with during his cavalry years, when orders sometimes required actions that felt more like murder than warfare. The distinction between justice and revenge often came down to motivation, whether you acted to prevent future harm or simply to satisfy personal anger. "Webb and his gang chose their path," Elias said finally. "They've stolen, murdered, and betrayed the trust of people who welcomed them into their community. Tomorrow they plan to rob the entire territory and disappear, leaving others to pay the price for their crimes. Stopping them isn't murder, it's preventing a greater evil." Billy was quiet for a while, apparently weighing this moral calculus against his own involvement with the gang. "I never killed anyone," he said eventually. "Held horses, carried messages, kept watch, but I never killed anyone." "That makes you accessory to murder, not a murderer. There's still time to choose a different ending to your story. By helping you kill my friends? By helping me stop criminals from destroying innocent lives." The conversation was interrupted by movement in the camp below. 3 riders had arrived, their horses showing signs of hard travel. Even at this distance, Elias could see that the newcomers were heavily armed and moved with the casual confidence of men accustomed to violence. "That's Martinez and his boys," Billy said, recognizing the riders. "They work the southern routes, mostly train robberies and isolated ranches. If they're here, it means the big meeting is definitely tomorrow night." Elias watched the men dismount and tend to their horses before disappearing into the main building. The camp now held at least 5 armed men, possibly more, all experienced criminals who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened their operation. "Tell me about the building layout," he said to Billy. "Where do they sleep? Where do they keep their weapons? Where would Webb hold his meeting?" Billy sketched a rough diagram in the dirt, using a stick to mark the various structures. "The bunkhouse is here, big enough for maybe 8 men. The main building is part storage, part meeting room. That's where Webb keeps his maps and plans. The other 2 buildings are just for supplies and equipment. Guards at night. Usually 2 men, 1 at each end of the valley. They change every 4 hours, but they're not too careful about it. Most nights, nothing happens up here." Elias studied the diagram, comparing it with what he could observe of the actual camp. The layout suggested that Webb had chosen the location for its defensibility rather than convenience. The buildings were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, and the surrounding terrain would make it difficult for attackers to approach without being seen. But defensibility worked both ways. The same features that made the camp difficult to attack also made it difficult to escape from if the defenders found themselves outmaneuvered. "There's something else," Billy said reluctantly. something I haven't told you." "What?" "Webb's got a backup plan. If anything goes wrong, if the law gets too close, or if someone threatens to expose the operation, he's got arrangements to disappear completely. New identities, money hidden in banks back east, even a ship waiting in San Francisco to take him wherever he wants to go." "How do you know all this?" "Because I was supposed to be part of it. Webb's been grooming me to take over some of the operation's logistics, maybe even replace him eventually. He trusts me more than he trusts most of the others." The revelation added another layer of complexity to the situation. Even if Elias could gather evidence of the gang's activities, even if he could survive a confrontation with armed criminals, Webb might simply vanish rather than face justice. The careful planning that had allowed him to operate undetected for years would also allow him to escape consequences. Unless, of course, those consequences came too quickly for escape plans to matter. "When does Webb plan to leave?" Elias asked. "Right after the tax shipment robbery. He figures the territorial government will turn every resource toward hunting the Crimson Riders once they realize the gang still exists. Better to disappear while everyone's looking for ghosts than wait around to be caught. So we have perhaps 3 days." Elias folded his map and returned it to his saddlebags. "You can help me stop this, or you can take your chances with whatever justice the territorial authorities might provide when they finally learn the truth. But either way, Marcus Webb's days as a respectable rancher are about to end." As darkness settled over the mountains, Elias made his final preparations for what he'd begun to think of as a reconnaissance in force. He would infiltrate the camp during the night, gather intelligence about the gang's plans and resources, and if the opportunity presented itself, eliminate key threats before they could mature into larger problems. It was the kind of mission he'd undertaken many times during his cavalry years, when small units operating behind enemy lines could accomplish more than entire regiments fighting conventional battles. The principles remained the same: move quietly, strike decisively, and never give your enemies time to organize effective resistance. Shadow raised his head as Elias checked his weapons one final time. The wolf's eyes caught the starlight like yellow flames, and for a moment he seemed almost healthy again, alert, focused, ready for whatever the night might bring. "You want to come with me, don't you?" Elias asked, softly. Shadow's tail moved in what might have been a weak attempt at wagging, but his body remained still on the blanket. The spirit was willing, but the flesh had been damaged beyond the ability to contribute meaningfully to combat operations. "Stay here with Billy," Elias instructed. "Keep him honest while I'm gone." He moved down the mountainside like a shadow himself, using every trick of fieldcraft he'd learned during 20 years of military service. The moon provided just enough light to navigate by without revealing his presence to casual observers, and the wind carried his scent away from the camp's horses. The first guard post was exactly where Billy had indicated a rocky outcropping that commanded a view of the main approach to the valley. The guard was young, bored, and more interested in staying warm than maintaining proper vigilance. Elias circled around him easily, approaching from the blind spot that every fixed position inevitably created. The camp itself proved even less secure than he'd hoped. The buildings were lit by oil lamps that created more shadows than illumination, and the sound of conversation from the main building suggested that the gang members were more focused on planning their upcoming robbery than protecting their current position. Moving from shadow to shadow, Elias worked his way closer to the main building, where voices could be heard discussing routes, timing, and the distribution of anticipated profits. A window had been left partially open to provide ventilation, allowing him to hear most of the conversation without exposing himself to observation. 3 wagons, maybe 4 guards total. A voice he didn't recognize was saying, "Easy pickings, especially if we hit them in the narrows where they can't maneuver." "What about afterward?" This voice was familiar, Marcus Webb, though he sounded different here than he had when playing the role of concerned rancher. Harder, more calculating. Henderson's going to know the Crimson Riders are back the moment word reaches him. So we stick to the plan. Scatter immediately after the job, lay low for a month, then meet in Denver to divide the proceeds. By the time Henderson organizes a proper search, we'll be long gone. And our friends in town? Morrison will handle the bank's records, make sure there's no trail connecting us to any of the money we've been depositing. Collins will misdirect any investigation toward Mexican bandits or displaced Indians. Same as always. Elias listened to them plan the destruction of everything he'd fought to help build in this territory, the casual dismissal of law and order that had taken years to establish. These weren't desperate men driven to crime by circumstance. They were predators who'd chosen to prey on their own neighbors for profit and convenience. The time for hesitation had passed. The ornate brass key felt cold in Elias's fingers as he examined it by starlight, having lifted it from Webb's saddlebags during his nocturnal reconnaissance of the camp. The key was unlike anything he'd seen in frontier country, elaborately decorated with scrollwork and bearing the unmistakable craftsmanship of Eastern metalworkers. Whatever it opened was important enough for Webb to carry it personally rather than trusting it to the gang's mountain stronghold. He'd returned to his own camp before dawn, moving through the darkness with the practiced stealth of a man who'd learned that survival often depended on remaining invisible to enemies. Billy had been awake when he arrived, keeping watch over Shadow while nursing a small fire that provided warmth without creating enough light to attract attention from the valley below. "Find anything useful?" Billy asked quietly. "Your friends are planning to hit the tax convoy tomorrow afternoon," Elias replied, settling beside the fire and accepting the cup of coffee Billy offered. 3 wagons, light guard, easy pickings according to them. That matches what I knew. Did you kill anyone?" The question carried a mixture of hope and fear, as if Billy couldn't decide whether he wanted Elias to have eliminated some of his former associates or preserved them for whatever justice might eventually follow. "Not yet," Elias said, "but I found this." He showed Billy the key, watching the young man's expression change as he recognized its significance. "Where did you get that?" "Webb's saddlebags. He had it wrapped in oiled leather, protected like it was worth more than gold." Elias turned the key over in his hands, studying the decorative elements. "What does it open?" Billy was quiet for a long moment, apparently wrestling with how much to reveal. "There's another cache," he said finally, "older than the main camp, hidden in a cave system about 3 miles from here. Webb calls it his insurance policy." Insurance? Against what? Against the gang deciding they don't need him anymore. Against the law getting too close. Against anything that might force him to disappear quickly. Billy gestured toward the key. "That cache contains enough gold and cash to keep a man comfortable for the rest of his life, plus documents he'd need to establish a new identity." The implications were clear. Webb had been planning his eventual retirement from criminal activities for years, accumulating resources and establishing escape routes that would allow him to vanish completely when the time came. The key represented not just wealth, but freedom from the consequences of his actions. "Show me," Elias said. They left Shadow resting in the grove of aspens, though the wolf's eyes followed them with obvious reluctance to be left behind. The journey to the hidden cache led them along trails that barely deserved the name animal tracks, winding between boulders and through stands of pines so dense they blocked most of the morning sunlight. Billy moved with the confidence of someone who'd made this trip many times, navigating turns and landmarks that would have been invisible to untrained eyes. The elevation continued to climb, bringing them into country where snow persisted year-round in shadowed crevices and the air carried the sharp bite of altitude. "There," Billy said, pointing toward what appeared to be solid rock face. "Webb found this cave system during his first year in the territory, back when he was still establishing his cover identity. He's been using it ever since." Closer inspection revealed a narrow opening in the cliff, partially concealed by fallen rocks and scrub vegetation. The entrance was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, but it opened into a larger chamber beyond where lamplight would be invisible from outside. Elias struck a match and lit the small oil lamp he'd brought, revealing a cave that extended much deeper into the mountain than its entrance suggested. The walls showed evidence of regular-use shelves carved into the rock, areas cleared for storage, and the kind of organization that spoke of military training applied to civilian purposes. "Webb's been busy," he observed, taking in the scope of the operation. The cave contained enough supplies to support a small army, cases of ammunition, preserved food, medical supplies, and camping equipment of the highest quality. But what caught Elias's attention was the locked chest sitting on a natural shelf in the deepest part of the chamber. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside the chest, wrapped in oiled leather and organized with meticulous care, was Webb's true treasure. Not just gold and currency, though there was plenty of both, but documentation that revealed the full scope of his operations over the past 3 years. Maps marked with the locations of previous robberies, correspondence with criminal contacts in other territories, detailed profiles of potential targets, including banks, payroll shipments, and wealthy ranchers. Most damaging of all, a complete record of payments made to various accomplices, including Sheriff Bradley's deputy and several prominent citizens of Cedar Falls. He kept records of everything, Elias said, amazed by the thoroughness of Webb's documentation. Names, dates, amounts enough evidence to hang half the territory's leadership. "Webb always said information was more valuable than gold," Billy replied. He figured if anyone ever tried to betray him, he could take them down with him. Among the papers, Elias found something that made his blood run cold. A detailed plan for what Webb called territorial destabilization. The tax shipment robbery was just the beginning. Webb intended to use the stolen funds to finance a series of attacks on territorial infrastructure, destroying bridges, burning government buildings, and assassinating key officials. He's not planning to disappear, Elias realized. He's planning to destroy the territorial government entirely. "What do you mean?" Elias showed Billy the documents, watching horror dawn on the young man's face as he read Webb's true intentions. He wants to create enough chaos to justify federal intervention. When Washington sends troops to restore order, Webb and his gang will be positioned to profit from the conflict, selling supplies to both sides, looting abandoned properties, maybe even negotiating with whatever government emerges from the chaos. That's insane. The casualties alone would number in the thousands before it was over. Webb's not just a criminal, Billy. He's planning to become a warlord. The scope of Webb's ambitions explained the careful planning, the multiple caches, and the recruitment of accomplices in positions of authority. This wasn't the work of a man planning retirement. It was the preparation for a campaign of destruction that would make the Crimson Rider's previous crimes seem like minor infractions. "We have to stop this," Billy said, his voice carrying a conviction that hadn't been there before. "Yes," Elias agreed, "we do. But stopping Webb would require more than simply preventing the tax shipment robbery. The gang leader had created a criminal infrastructure that could survive the loss of individual operations, individual members, even individual caches. To truly end the threat, Elias would need to destroy not just the gang, but the network of corruption that supported it. He began gathering the most incriminating documents, selecting evidence that would expose Webb's accomplices and reveal the full scope of the conspiracy. The gold and currency could remain. He had no interest in profiting from criminal activities, but the information was too valuable to leave behind. "There's something else," Billy said, pointing toward a section of the cave Elias hadn't yet explored. "Webb's got a workshop back there. He's been making special ammunition, preparing for something big." The workshop was a testament to Webb's military background and criminal ingenuity. Workbenches held tools for reloading cartridges, mixing explosives, and modifying weapons for specific purposes. Most disturbing were the specialized bullets' hollow points filled with mercury to increase their stopping power, and incendiary rounds designed to start fires on impact. "He's been preparing for war," Elias said, examining the ammunition. "Not just robbery, but actual warfare against anyone who tries to stop him." Among the workshop supplies, he found something that sparked a memory from his cavalry days. A distinctive type of explosive charge used for demolishing bridges and buildings. Webb had enough materials to level half of Cedar Falls if he chose to do so. "The territorial capital," Billy said suddenly. When Webb talked about federal intervention, he mentioned needing to eliminate the current territorial government first. I thought he meant through political pressure, but he means assassination and destruction. Elias felt the familiar coldness settling over him, the emotional distance that allowed him to function when faced with necessary violence. "How many people know about this cache?" "Just Webb and me. He brought me here twice to help move supplies, but he made sure I understood that talking about it would mean my death." "And the main camp, how many people there know about Webb's larger plans?" "Most of them just think they're planning one big robbery before retirement. Only Martinez and Thompson know about the territorial government angle, and they think it's just talk Webb, trying to make himself sound more important than he is. That ignorance might provide an advantage. If most of the gang believed they were participating in a final robbery before retirement, they might be less committed to fighting when faced with serious opposition. Men willing to steal weren't necessarily willing to die for a cause they didn't fully understand. "We need to get back to Shadow," Elias said, gathering the documents he'd selected. "And then we need to make some difficult decisions about what comes next." The return journey passed in thoughtful silence, both men wrestling with the implications of what they'd discovered. The morning sun had climbed high enough to provide genuine warmth, but Elias felt cold despite the pleasant weather. He'd seen war before, had participated in conflicts that killed thousands and scarred the land for generations. He'd hoped never to see such things again. But sometimes, as he'd learned during those dark years, the only way to prevent a larger war was to fight a smaller one first. Shadow was awake when they returned to camp, his yellow eyes bright with an alertness that seemed impossible given his injuries. He lifted his head as they approached, and for a moment Elias could swear the wolf was smiling. "He looks better," Billy observed. It was true. Shadow's breathing seemed easier. His wounds showed signs of beginning to heal, and his general demeanor suggested a return of strength that had been absent since his return from the mountains. "He knows," Elias said softly. "Somehow, he knows we found what he wanted us to find." As if responding to his words, Shadow struggled to his feet and took several shaky steps toward them. The movement clearly cost him considerable effort, but he managed to remain upright long enough to press his muzzle against Elias's hand in a gesture of affection and approval. "You did good, old friend," Elias murmured, scratching behind the wolf's ears. "You led us right to them." But their success in finding Webb's cache had also revealed the true scope of the threat they faced. This wasn't just about preventing a robbery or bringing criminals to justice. It was about stopping a plan that could plunge the entire territory into chaos and violence. The documents in Elias's saddlebags represented the key to exposing Webb's conspiracy, but only if they could survive long enough to present them to authorities who weren't already corrupted. And with the tax convoy scheduled to depart tomorrow morning, time was running out for any solution that didn't involve direct action. "What do we do now?" Billy asked. Elias looked toward the valley where the Crimson Riders' main camp lay hidden among the rocks and shadows. Tomorrow night, most of the gang would be gathered there for their final planning session before the robbery. They'd be confident, focused on their upcoming success, and probably not expecting trouble from any source. It would be the perfect time to end their threat permanently. "Now," he said quietly, "we get ready for war." The faded wanted poster was tucked between the pages of an old ledger book in Webb's hidden cache, its edges yellow with age, and its ink beginning to blur from years of handling. But the image was still clear enough to remove any doubt about the man's identity: scarred Jack Meridian, wanted for murder, robbery, and acts of war crimes during the final months of the conflict. The reward listed was $5,000 more money than most men saw in a lifetime. Elias studied the poster by lamplight, comparing the drawn features with his memories of Marcus Webb. The artist had captured the essential elements: the strong jawline, the deep-set eyes, the distinctive scar that ran from the left temple to the corner of the mouth. Webb had grown a beard and put on weight since the poster was created, but there was no mistaking the bone structure or the cold intelligence in those eyes. "I always wondered how he got that scar," Billy said, looking over Elias's shoulder at the document. "He told people it was from a mining accident, back before he became a rancher." "I know how he got it," Elias replied quietly. "I was there." The memory came back with unwelcome clarity. A late autumn afternoon in 1869, the third year of cavalry operations against irregular forces that had refused to accept the war's end. Elias's unit had been pursuing a band of Confederate raiders who'd been terrorizing Union supply lines, hitting convoys, and disappearing into the wilderness like ghosts. They'd finally cornered the raiders in a box canyon near the Colorado border, and what followed had been less a battle than a slaughter. Most of the Confederate irregulars had surrendered when they realized escape was impossible, but their leader, a man calling himself Scarred Jack, had fought to the end. Elias had been the one to finally bring him down, a saber cut that opened his face from temple to jaw and should have killed him outright. But somehow the man had survived, crawling away during the confusion of securing prisoners and tending wounded. By the time anyone realized he was gone, darkness had fallen and tracking became impossible. "You fought him before," Billy said, reading the recognition in Elias's expression. "I thought I'd killed him. Should have killed him." Elias folded the wanted poster and added it to the collection of documents he'd taken from the cache. "Instead, I just gave him a scar to remember me by. So this is personal. It became personal the moment he hurt Shadow. But it's bigger than that now." Elias gestured toward the pile of documents that revealed the scope of Webb's plans. "This isn't just about settling old scores. He's planning to destroy everything decent people have built in this territory." The return journey to their camp passed in contemplative silence, both men processing the implications of what they'd discovered. The wanted poster had provided the final piece of confirmation. Marcus Webb wasn't just a criminal wearing a respectable disguise. He was one of the most notorious war criminals of the past decade, a man whose survival had been considered impossible by the authorities, who'd declared him dead. Shadow greeted their return with obvious relief, struggling to his feet despite his injuries, and limping toward them with determination that spoke of recovering strength. The wolf's condition had improved dramatically since their departure, as if finding Webb's cache had somehow granted him permission to begin healing. "Look at him," Billy marveled. "Yesterday I thought he was dying, and now he's trying to walk." "He knows we found what he wanted us to find," Elias replied, kneeling beside Shadow and allowing the wolf to press his muzzle against his chest. "He can rest easy now, knowing his work is done." But Shadow's work might be finished, while Elias's was just beginning. The documents from Webb's cache provided overwhelming evidence of criminal activity, but they also revealed a timeline that left little room for conventional justice. The tax convoy would depart tomorrow morning, Webb's gang would strike tomorrow afternoon, and by tomorrow evening the territorial government would be dealing with the largest robbery in Wyoming's history. After that, Webb's plans called for a campaign of destruction that would make the original Crimson Riders' crimes seem trivial by comparison. "We need to get this information to someone in authority," Billy said, settling beside their small fire. "Maybe ride straight to the territorial capital, find someone who can't be bought or intimidated. That's 2 days hard riding, assuming we don't encounter any of Webb's people along the way." Elias spread his map on the ground, studying the routes between their current position and Cheyenne. "By the time we reached anyone with real authority, the robbery would be over, and Webb would be implementing the next phase of his plan. So what do you suggest?" Elias traced possible routes on the map, calculating distances and travel times against the schedule Billy had provided for the gang's activities. The numbers were unforgiving. Conventional justice would arrive too late to prevent the immediate crisis, and might not arrive at all if Webb's accomplices managed to misdirect or delay any investigation. "There's another option," he said finally. "We prevent the robbery ourselves." Billy stared at him in disbelief. 2 men against the entire gang? That's suicide. Not if we're smart about it, not if we use their own plans against them. From his saddlebags, Elias retrieved a collection of items he'd gathered during his reconnaissance of Webb's camp maps, schedules, and notes that detailed the gang's intended approach to the tax convoy robbery. Webb had planned the operation with military precision, accounting for every variable and contingency he could anticipate. But military training worked both ways. The same tactical principles that made Webb's plan effective could be turned against him by someone who understood them equally well. "Look at their route," Elias said, pointing to the marked path on Webb's map. "They're planning to hit the convoy in Eagle Pass, where the road narrows between rock walls. Classic ambush terrain. The wagons can't maneuver, guards can't take effective cover, and escape routes are limited." Right. So how does that help us? Because ambush terrain works both ways. If we can get there first, position ourselves correctly, we can turn their advantage into a disadvantage. Billy studied the map, beginning to understand the possibilities. "You want to ambush the ambushers." "Something like that. Webb's counting on surprise, superior numbers, and careful positioning. Take away any one of those advantages, and his entire plan becomes vulnerable." The strategy was risky, depending on precise timing and the kind of tactical execution that required experience Elias possessed, but Billy lacked. But it offered the possibility of preventing the robbery while simultaneously exposing Webb's gang to the kind of consequences that conventional justice might never deliver. "Even if we could pull it off," Billy said. "Even if we stop the robbery, what about Webb's larger plans? The territorial destabilization, the attacks on government buildings. He's got other men, other resources. Webb's operation depends on him being alive to coordinate it," Elias replied. "Remove the leader, and the rest of the conspiracy falls apart. Criminal organizations aren't democracies. They need strong central authority to function effectively." It was a lesson he'd learned during his cavalry years, when eliminating key Confederate leaders had often accomplished more than defeating entire units in conventional battles. Cut off the head, and the body would thrash around for a while before dying. But this particular head was well protected, surrounded by loyal followers, and operating from a position of apparent legitimacy that made direct action problematic. Webb couldn't simply be arrested or challenged to a duel. He'd built too many defenses, accumulated too much protection. Unless those defenses could be turned against him. "There's something else in these documents," Elias said, pulling out a particular set of papers. Letters between Webb and his accomplices in town, discussing the timing of various operations. "Look at this." Billy read over the correspondence, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "He's been planning to eliminate Sheriff Bradley. Not just Bradley. Anyone in town who might pose a threat to the gang's operations once they go public with their war against the territorial government." Elias indicated specific passages in the letters. "Morrison's been keeping lists of potential threats, people who might organize resistance or contact federal authorities. The lists were comprehensive and chilling. Sarah Miller was marked for elimination because her boarding house made her privy to too much information about travelers and their business. Doc Peterson was targeted because his medical knowledge might help treat wounded opponents. Even the school teacher was listed as a potential threat because educated people were more likely to organize effective resistance. They're planning to massacre the entire town, Billy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not immediately, but once they start their campaign against the territorial government, anyone who might oppose them becomes a liability. Elias folded the papers and returned them to his saddlebags. Which gives us another reason to stop this before it starts. The scope of Webb's ambitions was breathtaking in its ruthlessness. He'd spent years building a position of trust and authority in Cedar Falls, not to become a respectable citizen, but to identify potential threats and eliminate them efficiently when the time came. The man who'd convinced the town council to trust him with their financial planning was the same man who'd compiled lists of their names for future assassination. "What kind of man does something like that?" Billy asked. "The kind who stopped seeing other people as human beings a long time ago," Elias replied. "War does that to some men, strips away everything decent and leaves only the appetite for power and violence." He'd seen it before, during the worst days of the conflict, when prolonged exposure to brutality had transformed ordinary soldiers into something barely recognizable as human. Most men broke under such pressure, becoming either broken victims or savage predators. A few, like Webb, learned to hide their transformation behind masks of civilization while planning greater atrocities. "There's still time to ride for help," Billy said. "Maybe we could reach the territorial marshal, convince him to take action." With what proof? These documents could be forgeries, the maps could be fakes, and we'd be two men making accusations against pillars of the community. Elias shook his head. By the time we convinced anyone to investigate, Webb would be long gone, and his plans would be in motion. The frustration was familiar from his military days, when intelligence about enemy activities was often dismissed by superiors who preferred comfortable assumptions to difficult truths. Bureaucracy moved slowly, required extensive verification, and generally favored inaction over the kind of decisive response that crises demanded. "So we're really going to do this," Billy said. "Two men against an entire gang of killers." "Three," Elias corrected, glancing toward Shadow. "Don't count our friend out just yet." The wolf had been following their conversation with obvious interest, his yellow eyes moving between them as if understanding more than an animal should. When Elias mentioned him, Shadow's tail moved in what might have been approval, though he remained lying on his blanket to conserve strength. "He's in no condition to fight. Maybe not to fight, but definitely to help. Shadow knows these mountains better than any of us, and he's got senses we'll need if we're going to avoid walking into a trap." As if responding to the conversation, Shadow struggled to his feet and walked slowly to where Elias sat, studying the maps. The wolf's movement was still labored, but he showed none of the weakness that had characterized his condition earlier. Whatever recovery was taking place seemed to be accelerating. "You want to finish this, don't you?" Elias asked, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "You want to make sure the men who hurt you face justice." Shadow's response was to lie down beside Elias and rest his head on the man's leg, a gesture of trust and partnership that spoke louder than words about his intentions. Looking at his wounded friend, then at Billy's young face marked by growing determination, Elias felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. He'd led men into battle before, had made decisions that determined who lived and who died, but he'd never felt the responsibility more acutely than now. "All right," he said finally. "Here's what we're going to do." The false identity papers were hidden beneath a false bottom in Morrison's desk drawer, discovered when Elias broke into the bank during the pre-dawn hours while the town slept peacefully around them. The documents were professionally crafted birth certificates, military discharge papers, and bank records that painted Samuel Morrison as a respectable businessman from Philadelphia who'd come west to invest in frontier opportunities. But the papers also revealed his true identity, Jackson Meridian, younger brother of the notorious Scarred Jack Meridian, and co-architect of the Crimson Rider's resurrection from apparent death. "Brothers," Billy whispered, reading over the documents by lamplight in the bank's back office. "Webb and Morrison are brothers." Elias felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place with sickening clarity. The Meridian brothers had orchestrated not just their individual survival, but the entire deception that had allowed them to operate undetected for 3 years. While federal authorities congratulated themselves on eliminating the Crimson Riders, The gang's leadership had simply adopted new identities and moved their operations to a territory where no one would think to look for dead men. "It explains everything," he said, studying the forged documents with grudging admiration for their quality. How they coordinated their activities, how they avoided detection, how they managed to infiltrate positions of trust so effectively. The bank records told a story of careful financial manipulation spanning years. Morrison had used his position to monitor cash flows throughout the territory, identifying the most lucrative targets while ensuring that stolen funds could be laundered through legitimate business transactions. Every robbery the Crimson Riders had committed since their supposed demise had been planned using intelligence gathered through Morrison's banking connections. "Look at this," Billy said, pointing to a ledger that tracked deposits and withdrawals with military precision. "He's been moving money for the entire gang, keeping separate accounts under different names." The financial records revealed the true scope of the Crimson Riders' revival. They hadn't just survived Marshal Henderson's attack, they'd thrived, accumulating more wealth in 3 years of careful operations than they'd managed during their entire previous existence as a conventional outlaw gang. $20,000, Elias calculated, adding up the various accounts. Maybe more, if these records are incomplete. It was enough money to finance the territorial destabilization campaign Webb had planned, with sufficient reserves to support the gang's operations for years if necessary. The brothers had transformed themselves from desperate fugitives into wealthy conspirators, using legitimate business practices to fund illegitimate activities. But the documents also revealed something more immediately threatening: detailed plans for what Morrison called Phase 2 of their operation, scheduled to begin immediately after the tax convoy robbery. "They're not planning to disappear," Elias realized, reading through Morrison's careful notes. "They're planning to take over." The plan was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Using the stolen tax money as initial funding, the Meridian brothers intended to corrupt or eliminate every significant authority figure in the territory, replacing territorial government with their own criminal organization. They'd identified key officials for assassination, key businesses for takeover, and key resources for monopolization. "Governor Harrison is first on the list," Billy said, his voice tight with horror. "They're planning to kill the territorial governor, along with the territorial marshal, the chief justice, and anyone else who might organize effective resistance." Elias studied the assassination schedule Morrison had prepared. "They've got it all planned out: who dies when, how the deaths will be disguised as accidents or natural causes, and who they'll install as replacements." The replacement candidates were all men with criminal connections, individuals who could be trusted to follow orders while maintaining the appearance of legitimate authority. The Meridian brothers intended to rule Wyoming Territory through puppets, controlling every aspect of government and commerce while remaining safely hidden behind their respectable facades. "This isn't just robbery," Billy said. "This is revolution. Criminal revolution. They want to turn the entire territory into their personal kingdom, with them as the kings and everyone else as subjects." Elias gathered the most incriminating documents, adding them to the growing collection of evidence against the conspiracy. No law, no justice, no protection for anyone who doesn't serve their interests. The implications extended far beyond Wyoming's borders. If the Meridian brothers succeeded in their territorial takeover, they'd create a safe haven for criminal organizations throughout the West. Every outlaw, every escaped convict, every fugitive from justice would gravitate toward a territory where crime was not just tolerated, but actively encouraged by those in power. "We have to warn people," Billy said. "The governor, the marshal, everyone on their lists. Warn them with what? These documents could be dismissed as forgeries, and we'd be 2 men making accusations against pillars of the community." Elias folded the papers and secured them in his vest pocket. By the time we convinced anyone to take action, the Meridian brothers would know their security had been compromised and would accelerate their timeline. It was the same frustration he'd felt when studying Webb's cache, magnified by the scope of what they'd discovered. The evidence was overwhelming, but the conspiracy was too well established and too carefully protected to be exposed through conventional channels. Besides, he continued, warning potential victims assumes they'd believe us and take appropriate precautions. More likely, they'd dismiss our warnings as the ravings of a paranoid old soldier and continue their normal routines until it was too late. The bank's clock chimed 4 times, reminding them that dawn was approaching and their window for investigation was closing. They'd learned more than enough to understand the threat they faced, but knowledge, without the ability to act on it, was merely a burden. "There's something else," Billy said, indicating a section of Morrison's files they hadn't yet examined. "Letters from other territories, other gangs. The Meridian brothers aren't working alone." The correspondence revealed a network of criminal organizations spanning from Kansas to California, all coordinated by men who'd supposedly been killed or captured years earlier. The dead leaders of a dozen outlaw gangs had survived their apparent defeats, adopted new identities, and rebuilt their operations with unprecedented sophistication. "It's a conspiracy of the dead," Elias said, reading through letters signed with names he recognized from wanted posters. Men who were declared eliminated but actually just learned to hide better. The network included some of the most notorious criminals of the past decade, men whose survival would shock federal authorities and terrorize honest citizens throughout the West. They'd been coordinating their activities, sharing intelligence, and preparing for what they called the cleansing, a coordinated campaign to eliminate lawful authority throughout the frontier territories. Wyoming is just the beginning, Billy realized. They're planning to do this everywhere, starting here because it's remote enough to avoid immediate federal intervention, but valuable enough to provide the resources they'd need to expand their operations. Elias studied a map Morrison had annotated with target territories and projected timelines. If they succeed here, they'll have a model they can replicate across the West. The scope of the threat made their individual efforts seem almost laughably inadequate. 2 men and a wounded wolf against a conspiracy that spanned multiple territories and included dozens of the most dangerous criminals in America, it should have been cause for despair. But Elias found himself feeling oddly calm. He'd faced impossible odds before, during the darkest days of the war, when his unit had been surrounded, outnumbered, and given up for dead. Sometimes, when the situation seemed hopeless, the only rational response was to do something so unexpected that it changed the fundamental nature of the conflict. "We need to get back to Shadow," he said, extinguishing the lamp and preparing to leave the bank. "And then we need to make some final preparations." "For what?" "For ending this before it starts." They slipped out of the bank as quietly as they'd entered, leaving no evidence of their presence except for the missing documents Morrison would eventually discover. By the time the banker realized his security had been compromised, it would be too late for him to warn his brother or adjust their plans. The ride back to their mountain camp passed in thoughtful silence, both men processing the implications of what they'd learned. The conspiracy was larger, more dangerous, and more carefully planned than either had imagined, but it also depended entirely on secrecy and surprise for its success. Take away those advantages, force the conspirators to operate in the open before they were ready, and their sophisticated plans might crumble under the weight of their own complexity. Shadow was awake when they returned, his yellow eyes bright with an alertness that suggested continued recovery. The wolf struggled to his feet as they approached, moving with obvious effort but managing to remain upright long enough to greet them properly. "Look at him," Billy marveled. "Yesterday, he could barely lift his head, and now he's walking." "He knows something's about to happen," Elias replied, kneeling beside Shadow and checking his wounds. "Animals can sense changes coming that humans miss." The wolf's injuries were healing with remarkable speed, as if his body was responding to some internal imperative to recover in time for whatever trial lay ahead. His breathing was stronger, his movements more coordinated, and his general demeanor suggested a creature preparing for action rather than accepting defeat. "What are you thinking?" Billy asked, watching Elias study their supplies and equipment with obvious calculation. "I'm thinking," Elias said slowly, "that sometimes the best way to stop a conspiracy is to force it into the open before it's ready." He began laying out weapons and ammunition, checking each piece of equipment with the methodical care of a man preparing for battle. The documents they'd gathered provided overwhelming evidence of criminal activity, but evidence was only useful if there were honest authorities alive to act on it. "The tax convoy leaves Cheyenne this morning," he continued. "Webb's gang will hit it this afternoon in Eagle Pass. But what if Webb never makes it to Eagle Pass? What if something happens to disrupt their carefully planned timeline? You want to take him now, before the robbery. I want to force him to reveal himself, make him choose between maintaining his cover and protecting his operation." Elias checked the action on his Winchester, ensuring smooth operation despite its age. Criminal conspiracies depend on their leaders remaining hidden. Expose the leaders, and the followers scatter. It was a desperate plan, depending on precise timing and the kind of tactical execution that required more luck than skill. But it offered the possibility of ending the threat while the conspiracy was still vulnerable, before the Meridian brothers could implement their campaign of assassination and territorial takeover. What about Morrison and Deputy Collins? They'll have to choose whether to break cover to help Webb or maintain their disguises and let him face the consequences alone. Elias smiled grimly. Either choice exposes them to the kind of justice they've been avoiding. As the sun climbed higher, painting the mountain peaks with golden light, Elias made his final preparations for what he'd begun to think of as a last stand. Not just for himself and his companions, but for the principle that evil men shouldn't be allowed to prosper simply because they were clever enough to hide their true nature. Shadow watched these preparations with obvious approval, his tail moving in what might have been anticipation. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, man and wolf, united by friendship and the shared understanding that some fights were worth having regardless of the odds. The makeshift harness Elias fashioned from leather straps and buckles was designed to support Shadow's weight while allowing maximum mobility for his recovering limbs. Working by lamplight in the pre-dawn darkness, he adjusted each strap carefully, ensuring the wolf would be able to move without aggravating his injuries, while still being able to contribute meaningfully to whatever confrontation lay ahead. "You sure about this?" Billy asked, watching Elias test the harness around Shadow's chest and shoulders. "He's still hurt bad, and if things go wrong, things are already wrong." Elias replied, making final adjustments to ensure the straps wouldn't chafe against healing wounds. "Shadow's been part of this from the beginning. He deserves to be part of the ending." The wolf stood patiently as Elias worked, his yellow eyes bright with an intelligence that seemed almost human in its comprehension. When the harness was complete, Shadow took several experimental steps, testing the support it provided and apparently approving of its design. "He looks ready," Billy observed. "More than ready, he looks eager." It was true. Despite his injuries, despite the obvious pain that still marked his movements, Shadow carried himself with the bearing of a creature preparing for battle. His ears were alert, his stance balanced, and his gaze focused on the valley below, where the Crimson Riders' camp lay hidden among the rocks and shadows. Elias had spent the night formulating what he privately acknowledged was a desperate plan, one that depended more on audacity than tactical superiority. The gang outnumbered them by at least 3-1, held superior positions, and had the advantage of familiar terrain. But they also believed themselves safe, undetected, and facing no immediate threats to their carefully laid plans. That overconfidence would be their weakness. "Explain it to me one more time," Billy said, checking his rifle for what must have been the 10th time since midnight. Webb's expecting his gang to ride out for Eagle Pass around noon, planning to arrive in time to set up their ambush of the tax convoy. But what if Webb never makes it to that meeting? What if something forces him to reveal his true identity before he's ready? Elias spread his map on a flat rock, indicating the routes between the gang's mountain camp and the planned robbery site. Morrison's supposed to meet them at a halfway point, with final intelligence about the convoy's composition and timing. If we intercept that meeting, force Webb to choose between maintaining his cover and protecting his operation. He'll have to break character, Billy finished. Either way, people will know something's wrong. More than that, once Webb's exposed as something other than a respectable rancher, people will start asking questions about his associates. Morrison, Deputy Collins, maybe others we haven't identified yet. The whole conspiracy starts unraveling. It was a sound strategy in principle, but executing it would require precise timing and the ability to control a confrontation involving multiple armed criminals who had no reason to surrender peacefully. Elias had managed similar operations during his cavalry years, but those had involved trained soldiers rather than a young outlaw seeking redemption and a wounded wolf. What if they just kill us and continue with their plan? Billy asked. Then we'll have died trying to do the right thing, which is more than most people can say. Elias folded the map and secured it in his vest pocket. But I don't think it'll come to that. Webb's survived this long by being careful, calculating risks, and avoiding unnecessary exposure. Force him into an open confrontation, and he's operating outside his area of expertise. The plan depended on understanding Webb's psychology as much as his tactical capabilities. The man who'd built a criminal empire through patience and deception wouldn't be prepared for the kind of direct action that had characterized his earlier career as scarred Jack Meridian. 3 years of playing respectable rancher would have dulled his combat instincts while sharpening his politician's reflexes. As the sun climbed higher, painting the mountain peaks with golden light, Elias made his final preparations. Weapons cleaned and loaded, ammunition counted and distributed, emergency supplies packed in case they needed to move quickly. Everything organized with the methodical care of a man who understood that survival in combat often depended on preparation rather than courage. Shadow watched these activities with obvious approval, occasionally offering suggestions in the form of meaningful looks or subtle movements that indicated his agreement with specific decisions. The wolf's recovery continued to accelerate, as if his body was responding to some internal imperative to be ready for whatever trial lay ahead. "Time to go," Elias announced as the sun reached the proper angle for their planned approach to the gang's camp. They moved down the mountainside with the careful stealth of hunters stalking dangerous prey, using every fold in the terrain to mask their approach. Shadow traveled on his own power now, the harness providing support without limiting his natural agility. His movements were still careful, calculated to avoid aggravating his injuries, but he showed none of the weakness that had characterized his condition earlier. The trail Billy had described proved exactly where he'd indicated, winding through stands of aspen and around granite outcroppings that provided perfect concealment for their advance. Elias found himself impressed by the young man's knowledge of the terrain and his ability to move quietly despite his obvious nervousness. "There," Billy whispered, pointing toward a clearing where 2 riders waited beside a small stream. Webb and Morrison, exactly as Billy had predicted. The brothers were engaged in what appeared to be serious conversation, consulting maps and documents while their horses grazed nearby. Both men were armed, both carried themselves with the casual alertness of experienced criminals, but neither showed any awareness of being observed. "How do you want to do this?" Billy asked. Elias studied the terrain, identifying approaches and escape routes with the automatic assessment of a man who'd learned to evaluate tactical situations instinctively. The clearing offered advantages and disadvantages in roughly equal measure, open ground that would make concealment difficult, but also multiple directions for withdrawal if the confrontation went badly. Straightforward, he decided. We ride in openly, announce ourselves, and see how they react. If they maintain their covers, we know they're committed to avoiding exposure. If they draw weapons, we know they're willing to fight for their secret. And either way, we'll have forced them to make a choice that reveals their true nature. Exactly. It was the kind of calculated risk that had characterized many of Elias's most successful military operations, forcing enemies to act before they were ready, then exploiting whatever mistakes they made under pressure. The key was maintaining control of the situation long enough to achieve the desired outcome. They mounted their horses and rode into the clearing as if they belonged there, 3 travelers encountering 2 others at a convenient watering spot. Elias kept his hands visible but near his weapons, while Billy followed slightly behind and to the left, positioned to provide covering fire if necessary. Webb and Morrison looked up as they approached, their faces showing surprise that seemed genuine, but might have been carefully practiced. Both men's hands moved instinctively toward their weapons before stopping, a reaction that suggested combat experience despite their civilian appearance. "Morning, gentlemen," Elias called out in a friendly tone. "Beautiful day for a ride in the mountains." "Indeed it is," Webb replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone choosing words carefully. "Don't believe I've seen you in these parts before. Passing through on our way to Laramie. My name's Elias Boone. I've got a spread down near Cedar Falls." The introduction had its intended effect. Webb's expression shifted subtly, recognition replacing casual wariness as he processed the implications of meeting the man whose wolf had discovered their cache. Morrison's reaction was more obvious. His hand dropped toward his gun before stopping, as he realized the gesture would reveal too much. "Boone," Webb said slowly, "I heard you were having trouble with a wolf." "Had trouble. Problem's been resolved." Elias gestured toward Shadow, who sat calmly beside his horse, but watched both men with predatory intensity. "Turns out the wolf was trying to tell me something important." The statement hung in the mountain air like gun smoke, its implications clear to everyone present. Webb's face went through a series of subtle changes as he calculated options and their likely consequences, while Morrison's hand completed its interrupted journey toward his weapon. "That's close enough," Morrison said, his banker's facade dropping away to reveal something much harder underneath. "You gentlemen need to turn around and ride back where you came from." "Can't do that," Elias replied calmly. "Got business to discuss with Mr. Webb here. Or should I say, Mr. Meridian." The use of Webb's real name had the effect of a slap across the face. Both brothers went rigid, their careful masks falling away to reveal the cold calculation that had allowed them to survive when everyone believed them dead. The pretense was over, the careful deception that had protected them for 3 years finally exposed. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Webb said, his voice carrying a deadly certainty that left no doubt about his willingness to kill. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Elias responded. "The question is whether you're smart enough to surrender while you still can, or stupid enough to think you can shoot your way out of this." "Shoot our way out of what? There are 2 of you and 2 of us, hardly overwhelming odds." "3 of us," Billy said quietly, his rifle now openly aimed at Morrison's chest. "And I know where you keep your gold, your maps, and your lists of people marked for assassination." The revelation that Billy had switched sides hit both brothers like a physical blow. They'd trusted him with sensitive information, brought him into their inner circle, and now found themselves facing someone who knew enough to destroy everything they'd built. "You little bastard," Morrison snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "Don't," Elias warned, his own weapon now covering both men. "I've got no interest in killing anyone who's willing to surrender peacefully, but I won't hesitate to put down mad dogs that threaten innocent people." Webb's eyes moved between Elias, Billy, and Shadow, calculating odds and possibilities with the cold precision of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. His face showed no fear, only the professional assessment of someone evaluating a tactical situation. "You think you've won something," he said finally. "But you have no idea how deep this goes, how many people are involved. Kill us, and you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder." "Maybe. But the rest of my life will be spent knowing I prevented you from destroying everything decent people have built in this territory." As if responding to some invisible signal, Shadow rose to his feet and took several steps toward the two criminals. The wolf's movements were fluid despite his injuries, his yellow eyes fixed on Webb with an intensity that suggested very personal interest in the outcome of this confrontation. "Your wolf remembers me," Webb observed. "He remembers what you did to him. And he remembers what you planned to do to others." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 4 armed men and a wolf facing each other across 20 yards of mountain clearing while the sun climbed higher toward its zenith. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried as it circled above the trees, the only sound breaking the deadly silence. Time seemed suspended, balanced on the edge of violence that could erupt at any moment and change everything forever. The dynamite cache had been hidden beneath the floor of the gang's supply building, carefully arranged charges that Webb had planned to use for his campaign against territorial infrastructure. Now, as Morrison's hand completed its movement toward his gun, Elias found himself facing the ironic possibility that the criminals' own weapons might provide the solution to ending their threat. The first shot came from Morrison, fired in desperation as he realized surrender meant facing justice for 3 years of accumulated crimes. The bullet went wide, striking a tree behind Elias and sending bark flying, but it shattered the tense standoff and sent everyone diving for cover. Elias rolled behind a fallen log, his rifle already tracking toward Webb's position as the gang leader scrambled for the protection of nearby rocks. Billy had found cover behind his horse, using the animal's bulk to shield himself while maintaining a clear field of fire toward the stream where both criminals had taken refuge. "Give it up, Webb," Elias called out. "Your secret's exposed, your plans are finished, and help isn't coming." "Like hell," came the reply, punctuated by 2 rapid shots that chipped bark from the log, protecting Elias. "You think killing us changes anything? We've got men in every town between here and the territorial capital." It might have been true, but Elias doubted the network was as extensive as Webb claimed. Criminal conspiracies depended on secrecy and careful compartmentalization. The brothers had probably kept most of their associates ignorant of the larger plan to maintain operational security. Shadow had disappeared during the initial exchange of gunfire, melting into the underbrush with the natural stealth of a predator seeking advantage. Elias could catch occasional glimpses of grey fur moving through the trees, positioning for whatever opportunity might present itself. "Morrison's moving," Billy shouted, triggering a shot that forced the banker to duck back behind the rocks. "Trying to circle around." The dynamite cache had been hidden beneath the floor of the gang's supply building, carefully arranged charges that Webb had planned to use for his campaign against territorial infrastructure. Now, as Morrison's hand completed its movement toward his gun, Elias found himself facing the ironic possibility that the criminals' own weapons might provide the solution to ending their threat. The first shot came from Morrison, fired in desperation, as he realized surrender meant facing justice for 3 years of accumulated crimes. The bullet went wide, striking a tree behind Elias and sending bark flying, but it shattered the tense standoff and sent everyone diving for cover. Elias rolled behind a fallen log, his rifle already tracking toward Webb's position as the gang leader scrambled for the protection of nearby rocks. Billy had found cover behind his horse, using the animal's bulk to shield himself while maintaining a clear field of fire toward the stream where both criminals had taken refuge. "Give it up, Webb," Elias called out. "Your secret's exposed, your plans are finished, and help isn't coming." "Like hell," came the reply, punctuated by 2 rapid shots that chipped bark from the log protecting Elias. "You think killing us changes anything? We've got men in every town between here and the territorial capital." It might have been true, but Elias doubted the network was as extensive as Webb claimed. Criminal conspiracies depended on secrecy and careful compartmentalization. The brothers had probably kept most of their associates ignorant of the larger plan to maintain operational security. Shadow had disappeared during the initial exchange of gunfire, melting into the underbrush with the natural stealth of a predator seeking advantage. Elias could catch occasional glimpses of grey fur moving through the trees, positioning for whatever opportunity might present itself. "Morrison's moving!" Billy shouted, triggering a shot that forced the banker to duck back behind the rocks. Trying to circle around. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Meridian brothers had chosen their meeting spot, good cover, multiple escape routes, and terrain that favored defenders over attackers. If they managed to separate and establish crossfire positions, they could pin down Elias and Billy, while one of them escaped to warn the rest of the gang. Elias made a decision that went against every instinct developed during 20 years of military service. Instead of maintaining his defensive position and trying to wear down the enemy through careful fire, he broke cover and charged directly toward Webb's position, counting on surprise and aggressive action to overwhelm the gang leader's tactical planning. The maneuver worked better than he had any right to expect. Webb, anticipating a prolonged firefight from fixed positions, was caught off guard by the direct assault. His return fire was hurried, inaccurate, and gave Elias the opportunity to close distance while maintaining momentum. They collided among the rocks beside the stream, weapons forgotten in favor of the kind of close-quarters combat that came down to strength, skill, and determination. Webb was younger and probably stronger, but Elias had the advantage of experience and the driving fury of a man who'd seen too much evil disguised as respectability. The fight was brutal and brief. Webb managed to land several solid blows that left Elias seeing stars, but the older man's superior technique and desperate motivation proved decisive. When it was over, Webb lay unconscious among the rocks, blood trickling from a cut above his eye, while Elias struggled to catch his breath and check for serious injuries. "Behind you!" Billy's warning came just in time. Elias spun to see Morrison emerging from cover, revolver raised and aimed with deadly intent. The banker's face showed the cold calculation of a man who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do so again, but his attention was focused entirely on Elias, creating a blind spot he didn't notice until it was too late. Shadow materialized from the underbrush like a gray ghost, moving with fluid grace despite his injuries. The wolf's attack was perfectly timed and precisely executed, a leap that carried him into Morrison's back just as the banker's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot went wide, the bullet striking harmlessly into the trees, while Morrison and Shadow crashed to the ground in a tangle of fur, teeth, and desperate human panic. The banker tried to bring his weapon around for a second shot, but Shadow's jaws clamped down on his wrist with bone-crushing force, making accurate aim impossible. "Shadow, enough," Elias commanded, and the wolf immediately released his grip and backed away, though he remained poised to renew the attack if necessary. Morrison clutched his injured wrist, his weapon forgotten in the dirt beside him. "You broke my arm, you bastard!" "Be grateful he didn't break your neck," Elias replied, retrieving the banker's revolver. "Shadow's got every right to kill you after what you and your brother put him through." With both criminals subdued, the immediate crisis was over, but Elias knew their problems were far from solved. Webb's gang would be expecting their leader to arrive at the planned meeting point within a few hours, and when he failed to appear, they'd either proceed with the tax convoy robbery on their own or investigate what had happened to him. "What do we do with them?" Billy asked, binding Webb's hands with rope from his saddlebags. "We take them back to town," Elias decided. Let the people of Cedar Falls see what their respected rancher and trusted banker really are. They might not believe it. Webb's got a lot of friends, people who'll vouch for his character. They'll believe it when they see the evidence we collected from Morrison's bank and Webb's cash. Hard to argue with documented proof of criminal conspiracy. But even as he said it, Elias realized the challenge they still faced. Exposing Webb and Morrison would certainly damage the Crimson Riders organization, but it wouldn't necessarily stop the tax convoy robbery or prevent other gang members from implementing whatever contingency plans they might have developed. There's another problem, he continued, studying the bound criminals. Deputy Collins is still in town, still in position to interfere with any attempt to bring these two to justice. And we don't know how many other accomplices they might have in positions of authority. Webb had regained consciousness during their conversation, though he remained quiet and still, apparently calculating his options while listening to his captors discuss their plans. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the cold certainty of a man who believed he still held winning cards. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "Even if you expose me and my brother, even if you convince people we're not what we seem, the damage is already done. The tax convoy will be hit whether I'm there or not, and my men have orders to proceed with Phase 2 regardless of what happens to us." Phase 2? The elimination of key territorial officials, starting with Governor Harrison. You can't stop it now. The wheels are already in motion. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with mountain air. If Webb was telling the truth, if the conspiracy had developed enough momentum to continue without its leadership, then stopping the Meridian brothers might accomplish nothing except signing death warrants for innocent officials throughout the territory. "When?" he demanded. Webb's smile was cold and utterly without mercy. "Soon enough, and there's nothing you can do to prevent it." The taunt might have been designed to provoke rash action, but it also contained enough truth to be genuinely threatening. Criminal organizations that survived for years typically developed the kind of operational independence that allowed them to function even when leadership was compromised. "Maybe," Elias said finally, "but we can sure as hell try." He began gathering the weapons and equipment scattered around the clearing, preparing for what might be the most important ride of his life. If there was any chance of preventing the assassinations Webb had planned, they'd need to reach the territorial capital ahead of whatever killers were already moving toward their targets. Shadow watched these preparations with obvious approval, his tail moving in what might have been anticipation. Whatever damage his encounter with the Crimson Riders had done to his body, it hadn't diminished his spirit or his willingness to stand with his human friend against whatever dangers lay ahead. "You ready for one more fight, old boy?" Elias asked, checking the wolf's harness and making sure his injuries weren't being aggravated by the recent violence. Shadow's response was to walk toward the horses, moving with fluid grace despite his wounds, ready to continue whatever journey justice demanded. "All right then," Elias said, mounting Copper and checking his weapons one final time. "Let's go save a territory." The silver spurs that had adorned scarred Jack Meridian's boots for over a decade lay scattered in the dirt, where they'd fallen during his final struggle, their polished surfaces catching the afternoon sunlight like fallen stars. Elias picked them up with hands that trembled only slightly, studying the ornate metalwork that had been crafted by Mexican artisans and worn by a man who'd used them to terrorize the frontier for years. Webb, no longer able to maintain his respectable facade, glared up at him from where he lay bound against a tree, his face bearing the marks of their earlier fight, and his eyes burning with the fury of a predator finally brought to bay. "You think you've won something," he snarled, blood trickling from his split lip. "But this is bigger than me, bigger than my brother. Cut off one head, and two more will take its place." "Maybe," Elias replied, tucking the spurs into his saddlebag. "But at least those heads won't belong to men who've spent years earning the trust of innocent people just to betray it." The ride back toward Cedar Falls had taken them through country that seemed different now, the same mountains and valleys, but viewed through the lens of knowledge that changed everything. This wasn't just beautiful wilderness anymore, but terrain that had sheltered one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in territorial history. Billy rode alongside, his face showing the strain of everything they'd discovered and the weight of decisions he'd made that couldn't be undone. Morrison, bound and secured to his horse, remained sullenly silent, perhaps calculating what mercy he might obtain through cooperation or what revenge he might achieve through continued defiance. But it was Shadow who concerned Elias most. The wolf had pushed himself beyond his physical limits during the confrontation, and now the adrenaline that had sustained him was fading, leaving behind the reality of injuries that were still far from healed. He moved carefully beside Copper, his breathing labored and his steps showing the deliberation of a creature fighting to remain upright through sheer determination. "He needs rest," Billy observed, noting the wolf's condition. "We all need rest, but first we need to make sure Webb's gang doesn't succeed with whatever they're planning." The challenge of stopping a criminal conspiracy that might already be in motion weighed heavily on Elias's mind. Even with the Meridian brothers captured and their secret exposed, Deputy Collins remained in Cedar Falls, positioned to interfere with any attempt to organize effective resistance. And somewhere in the territory, assassins were moving toward targets that included the governor and other key officials. "There's the town," Billy said, pointing toward the cluster of buildings that marked Cedar Falls in the distance. From their elevated position, they could see the normal activities of a frontier community, people moving about their business, smoke rising from chimneys, children playing in the streets. It looked peaceful, prosperous, completely unaware that its trusted banker and respected rancher were actually notorious criminals whose capture might trigger a wave of violence that could destroy everything they'd worked to build. "How do we do this?" Billy asked. "Just ride into town with our prisoners and hope people believe us?" "Something like that. Though I suspect the evidence will speak for itself once people have a chance to examine it." Elias patted his saddlebags, which contained the documents they'd gathered from Morrison's bank and Webb's mountain cache. The paper trail was overwhelming, detailed records of criminal activities, correspondence with known outlaws, and plans for territorial takeover that no honest person could dismiss as forgeries or misunderstandings. But first, they had to survive whatever reception awaited them in Cedar Falls. As they descended toward the town, Shadow suddenly stopped moving, his ears pricked forward and his body tense with alert attention. The wolf was staring toward the main street, where something had caught his attention that human senses couldn't detect. "What is it, boy?" Elias asked, following Shadow's gaze but seeing nothing unusual. Then he heard it, the sound of rapid hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town, multiple riders moving at speed that suggested urgency or alarm. Deputy Collins appeared first, leading a group of 6 men that Elias recognized as some of Cedar Falls' most prominent citizens. "That's not a welcoming committee," Billy observed grimly. "No, it's not." Collins and his riders approached with the grim determination of men who'd already made up their minds about what needed to happen. The deputy's hand rested on his weapon, and his companions carried themselves with the nervous energy of people who'd been convinced they were facing a serious threat. "Elias Boone," Collins called out when they were within hailing distance, "you're under arrest for the murders of Marcus Webb and Samuel Morrison." The accusation hit like a physical blow, stunning in its audacity and timing. Somehow, Collins had learned about their confrontation with the Meridian brothers and had managed to turn it into evidence of criminal activity on Elias's part. "Deputies don't make arrests for murder without evidence," Elias replied, his hand moving closer to his rifle. "And last I checked, both Webb and Morrison were very much alive. We found blood at their meeting place, signs of a struggle, and no trace of either man. That's evidence enough in my book." It was a clever piece of misdirection, using the aftermath of their confrontation to create a narrative that painted Elias as the criminal while positioning Collins as the lawman seeking justice. The deputy had probably been watching for signs that the Meridian brothers' operation was compromised and had moved quickly to control the situation when they failed to return as scheduled. "Check your facts, deputy," Billy said, his voice carrying a confidence that surprised Elias. "Webb and Morrison are right here, alive and available to answer questions about their criminal activities." He gestured toward the bound prisoners, and Elias saw Collins's face change as he realized his carefully constructed narrative had just collapsed. The deputy had expected to find evidence of the brothers' deaths, not their capture and exposure. "Those men are pillars of the community," one of Collins's companions protested. "Whatever you think you've discovered, we've discovered enough evidence to hang them both." Elias interrupted, drawing the collection of documents from his saddlebags. Bank records, correspondence with known criminals, and detailed plans for robbing the territorial tax shipment. The mention of documentary evidence visibly shook Collins's confidence. He'd probably hoped to eliminate Elias and his companions before they could present whatever proof they'd gathered, but now found himself facing the possibility that their accusations could be substantiated. "Even if that's true," Collins said, his voice taking on a desperate edge, "you had no authority to arrest these men. You're civilians, vigilantes at best." "We're citizens preventing crimes against the territory," Elias replied, "which is more than can be said for you, Deputy Collins. Or should I call you by your real name?" The challenge hung in the mountain air like gunsmoke, its implications clear to everyone present. Collins's face went through a series of subtle changes as he calculated options and their likely consequences, realizing that his own cover might be as compromised as that of the Meridian brothers. "I don't know what you're implying," he said finally. "I'm implying that you're another criminal wearing a badge, just like your friends here wore respectable facades." Elias's voice carried the deadly calm that had characterized his most dangerous moments as a cavalry officer. "And I'm suggesting you surrender now, while you still can." The standoff stretched taut between the two groups of riders, armed men facing each other across 30 yards of open ground, while the fate of an entire territory hung in the balance. In the distance, the town of Cedar Falls continued its normal activities, unaware that the next few minutes might determine whether it survived as a lawful community or descended into the kind of chaos that destroyed frontier settlements. Shadow moved closer to Elias's horse, his yellow eyes fixed on Collins with predatory intensity. Despite his injuries, despite the obvious exhaustion that marked his movements, the wolf was preparing for one final confrontation with the men who'd caused so much suffering. "Your move, deputy," Elias said quietly. Collins's hand dropped toward his weapon, and everything exploded into violence once more, but this time Shadow was ready. The wolf launched himself forward with a speed and grace that belied his injuries, covering the distance between groups in seconds and striking Collins just as the deputy's gun cleared its holster. The deputy's shot went wild, striking harmlessly into the sky, while Shadow's weight carried both of them to the ground in a tangle of fur, teeth, and desperate human panic. By the time Collins could organize effective resistance, it was too late. Elias and Billy had their weapons trained on his companions, while Shadow held the deputy pinned with jaws that could crush bone if provoked. "Enough," Elias commanded, and Shadow immediately released his grip, though he remained poised to renew the attack if necessary. Collins lay gasping in the dirt, his weapons scattered beyond reach, his carefully maintained facade finally stripped away to reveal the criminal underneath. Around him, his companions sat their horses in stunned silence, beginning to understand that everything they'd believed about their community's leadership had been built on lies. "It's over," Elias said, surveying the scene of their final victory. "All of it." Webb and Morrison, watching from where they remained bound to their horses, said nothing, but their faces showed the resignation of men who'd finally run out of options, schemes, and places to hide from the consequences of their actions. In the distance, The first residents of Cedar Falls were emerging from their buildings, drawn by the sound of gunfire and the realization that something significant was happening on the outskirts of their town. Soon they'd learn the truth about the men they'd trusted, the conspiracy that had operated under their noses, and the violence that had been prevented by the courage of a few individuals willing to risk everything for justice. Shadow walked slowly back to Elias's side, his movements careful but determined, his yellow eyes bright with satisfaction at a job finally completed. The wolf had led them to the truth, fought beside them when fighting was necessary, and lived to see justice done to the men who'd caused him so much pain. "Good boy," Elias murmured, reaching down to scratch behind the wolf's ears. "You did real good." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elias felt the weight of responsibility finally lifting from his shoulders. The Crimson Riders were finished, their conspiracy exposed. Their threat to innocent people ended forever. The silver spurs in his saddlebag would serve as a reminder of what happened when evil men tried to hide behind masks of respectability, and of the price that good people sometimes had to pay to preserve the things that mattered most. The memorial stone was carved from granite quarried in the same mountains where Shadow had made his final stand, its surface polished, smooth, and etched with simple words that captured the essence of a friendship that had transcended the boundaries between man and beast. Shadow, loyal friend and true companion, he led the way to justice. 3 months had passed since the exposure of the Crimson Riders' conspiracy, 3 months of trials, investigations, and the slow process of rebuilding trust in institutions that had been corrupted by men who'd worn masks of respectability while planning acts of unspeakable evil. The territorial government had survived, stronger for having faced and overcome the threat that might have destroyed it entirely. Elias knelt beside the grave he'd dug on a hillside overlooking his ranch, the same hillside where he and Shadow had watched countless sunrises during their years together. The wolf had lived for 2 weeks after their final confrontation with the Meridian brothers, long enough to see justice done and his human friend safe, before finally succumbing to injuries that had been too severe for even his remarkable constitution to overcome. "I kept my promise," Elias said softly, placing a fresh bouquet of wildflowers beside the stone. "They're all in custody now, every last one of them. Webb and Morrison are waiting for the hangman. Collins got 20 years in territorial prison, and the rest of the gang scattered to the winds once their leadership was gone." The afternoon breeze stirred the grass around the grave, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant sound of cattle moving through the pastures below. Life on the ranch had returned to something approaching normal, though Elias found himself missing the quiet companionship that had made solitude bearable for so many years. Sarah Miller had been visiting more frequently since Shadow's death, bringing meals and conversation that helped fill the silence that seemed to echo through the ranch house. She'd lost her boarding house when the territorial investigation revealed that Morrison had been manipulating property loans to consolidate control over key businesses, but she'd adapted with the resilience that characterized the best of frontier women. "You're not eating enough," she'd observed during her most recent visit, noting the looseness of his clothes and the hollow look around his eyes. "Shadow wouldn't want you to waste away from grief." She was probably right, but food had lost much of its appeal since the wolf's death. Meals had become fuel rather than pleasure, consumed mechanically while his mind wandered to memories of yellow eyes watching from beside the fireplace and the sound of paws on wooden floors. The territorial marshal had made several trips to Cedar Falls during the investigation, reviewing evidence and taking testimony from witnesses who'd been shocked to learn the truth about men they'd trusted. Marshal Henderson had been particularly interested in the documents Elias had recovered from Webb's cache, using them to identify and arrest accomplices throughout the territory. "You saved more lives than you'll ever know," Henderson had told him during their final meeting. Webb's plans would have plunged the entire territory into chaos, maybe triggered federal intervention that would have set us back decades. The praise was gratifying, but it couldn't fill the emptiness that Shadow's death had left behind. Elias had discovered that friendship, once lost, created a vacuum that couldn't be filled by abstract concepts like justice or duty. Billy Graves had testified against his former associates with a courage that had impressed even the skeptical territorial prosecutor. The young man's cooperation had been crucial in mapping the full extent of the conspiracy and ensuring that every participant faced appropriate consequences. He'd been offered a position with the Territorial Marshal's office, recognition of his contribution to justice, and an opportunity to make amends for his earlier mistakes. "I keep thinking about what you said," Billy had told Elias during his final visit to the ranch, "about how a man can choose what battles to fight. I want to fight the right battles from now on." Standing now beside Shadow's grave, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains, Elias reflected on the battles he'd chosen and their ultimate cost. Justice had been served, evil had been exposed and punished, and innocent people throughout the territory could sleep more safely in their beds. But the friend who'd made it all possible was gone, and no amount of righteousness could bring him back. A sound from the direction of the house drew his attention, the crunch of wagon wheels on gravel and the familiar voice of Sarah calling his name. She'd probably brought dinner again, along with whatever news had filtered into town from the wider world. Her visits had become a bright spot in days that otherwise stretched long and empty. "I brought company," she called out as he walked down from the hillside. "Someone who's been wanting to meet you." The wagon held more than just Sarah and her usual basket of supplies. Sitting beside her was a small figure wrapped in a blanket, a boy perhaps 8 years old, with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed too old for his face. Behind them, secured with rope and moving carefully to avoid jostling, was a wooden crate that showed signs of recent construction. "This is Tommy," Sarah explained as Elias approached. "His parents were killed in a Crimson Riders robbery near Laramie 2 years ago. He's been staying at the Territorial Orphanage, but well, the territory thought he might benefit from some time in the country." The boy studied Elias with the cautious assessment of someone who'd learned not to trust easily, his eyes taking in the weathered face and work-worn hands of a man who'd seen his share of both violence and peace. Tommy's expression reminded Elias of another creature who'd needed time to learn that not all humans posed a threat. "What's in the crate?" Elias asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "A gift," Sarah replied with a smile, "from Marshal Henderson and the people of the territory. They thought Shadow's work deserved to be continued." The crate's occupant announced itself with a soft whine, a sound that sent a jolt of recognition through Elias's chest. Sarah lifted the crate's lid, revealing a wolf pup perhaps 3 months old, with grey fur and yellow eyes that seemed remarkably familiar despite the differences in age and size. "Found him up in the medicine bows," Sarah explained. "His mother had been killed by a bear, and he was barely alive when the marshal's men discovered him. They remembered your story about Shadow, thought you might be the right person to raise another wolf." Tommy leaned forward, studying the pup with obvious fascination. "Can I pet him?" "Carefully," Elias cautioned, though he was already reaching into the crate himself. The pup's fur was soft beneath his fingers, and the small creature pressed against his hand with the trust that only the very young could display. "He doesn't have a name yet," Sarah said. "The marshal thought you should choose." Elias lifted the pup from its crate, feeling the warmth and weight of new life in his hands. The creature looked up at him with eyes that held the same intelligence he'd recognized in Shadow years earlier, the same stubborn determination to survive despite every reason to surrender. "Hope," he said after a moment's consideration. "His name is Hope." Tommy smiled for the first time since his arrival, the expression transforming his serious face into something more appropriate for a child. "That's a good name." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elias found himself sitting on his porch with unexpected companions, a woman whose quiet strength reminded him that solitude was a choice rather than a necessity. a boy who needed to learn that the world still contained good people worth trusting, and a wolf pup who would grow up knowing safety rather than fear. The memorial stone on the hillside caught the last rays of sunlight, its granite surface reflecting the light like a beacon, visible for miles across the valley. Shadow's work was finished, his sacrifice had meaning, and the justice he'd helped achieve would protect innocent people for generations to come. But life continued, as it always did, and new friendships were possible even after old ones ended. The ranch, that had been a refuge for one man and one wolf, could become a home for people who needed healing, purpose, and the chance to build something better from the ashes of what had been lost. Hope stirred in Elias's lap, small paws kneading against his vest as the pup settled into sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to choose the right battles in a world that would always need people willing to stand against darkness. Tonight, though, was for remembering a friend who'd led the way to justice, and for looking toward a future that honored his sacrifice by protecting the things that mattered most. The frontier was vast and often harsh, but it was also a place where redemption was possible, where broken things could be mended, and where loyalty between friends could transcend even death itself. In the distance, a wolf howled, not Shadow, but perhaps one of his descendants, calling to the moon and the mountains with the same wild song that had echoed through these valleys for countless generations. The sound was mournful but not sad, a reminder that some bonds endured beyond the temporary separation of death. Elias listened to the call and found himself smiling for the first time in months. Shadow's story was complete, but Hope's was just beginning, and the circle of friendship that had started with a dying pup in a mountain cave continued with another small life rescued from the wilderness and given the chance to become something extraordinary. The memorial stone stood sentinel on the hillside, marking not an ending but a transition from one chapter of courage and loyalty to another, from justice earned through sacrifice to peace protected by vigilance. And in the growing darkness, surrounded by the people and creatures who'd found their way to his ranch, seeking shelter and purpose, Elias Boone understood that some victories were measured not in the enemies defeated, but in the love preserved and the hope sustained for future generations. The dying wolf had indeed hugged his owner before being put down, but what the cowboy had noticed wasn't just something strange, it was something transformative. A final gift from a faithful friend who'd led them all toward the light that existed even in the darkest corners of the world.